Callum Rourke tasted iron on his tongue as the alien warlord pressed a boot into his chest, grinding him into the frozen ground. His visor lay in shattered pieces around him, scattered like broken teeth. The warlord demanded that he beg, broadcasting the moment across a dozen star systems, as if humiliation were the true weapon of war. Callum forced himself to breathe through the sharp stab of cracked ribs, refusing to surrender a single sound. Pain had never frightened him. Only the idea of failing others ever had. 30 minutes earlier, he had stood at the edge of the same ridge, watching the alien vessel descend through a curtain of snowfall. He had expected them eventually, though he'd hoped retirement in the Alaskan wilderness would last longer than 2 quiet years. The UN envoy who dragged him from the cabin looked half frozen and fully terrified, clutching a tablet that projected the alien ultimatum. Earth must send a champion, a single combatant, to determine its right to sovereignty. It was an ancient alien tradition, one Callum had no interest in honoring. He told them to find someone else. They told him there was no one else. The numbers, the psychological profiles, the survival probabilities, it all pointed to him. He didn't accept out of pride or duty. He accepted because the envoy's hands shook when she admitted humanity had no backup plan. And because Callum, despite every attempt to disappear, still couldn't turn his back on people who needed help. Not after the lives he had failed to save long ago. The battlefield the aliens constructed atop the ridge twisted the falling snow into unnatural spirals. Energy projectors hummed, bending gravity in faint ripples that made the air feel thick. Callum stepped into the arena wearing patched armor that carried a lifetime of memories. A scorched American flag sewn onto the chest plate, a worn compass rescued from a lost friend, and enough improvised attachments to look more scavenger than soldier. The alien champion laughed at the sight, teeth like obsidian blades, mocking the sentimental relics of a primitive mammal. Callum didn't bother replying. Silence had always served him better than bravado. He studied the alien's stance, the vibration in its leg servos, the slight overextension of its dominant arm. Weaknesses existed everywhere, even in beings bred for conquest. He only needed time to find them. The first strike came too fast for most eyes, a concussive pulse that cracked his ribs and hurled him across the arena. The second shattered his visor. The third slammed him into the snowbank where he now lay gasping. The alien crowd, projected as holograms around them, roared with approval. The warlord activated a translation device, so every watching species could understand his demand. Kneel, confess inferiority, and the suffering would end. Callum pushed a glove into the snow, feeling its cold bite through the damaged insulation. He rose inch by inch, body screaming in protest. The humiliation the warlord intended was meaningless to him. He had lived through far worse failures than a broken helmet and an audience of hostile aliens. He straightened his spine despite the pain, meeting the warlord's gaze with a calm steadiness that unsettled even the holographic spectators. "You should have brought more," he whispered, every word scraped from raw lungs. The warlord paused, confusion flickering through his features before hardening into fury. Callum welcomed the reaction. Anger created openings. Openings created chances. And Callum, even battered and bleeding, was far from beaten. Snow swirled harder as the aliens' weapon systems powered up for another strike, light reflecting off every drifting flake. Callum exhaled once, steadying himself, ready to move before the next blow landed. The battle was nowhere near finished. If anything, it had just begun. Callum had always believed that memory was the sharpest blade a man could carry, and now, as the alien warlord advanced through the curtain of whirling snow, those memories surfaced with merciless clarity. He felt each one strike with the same precision as the blows that had cracked his ribs. The past he tried to bury was rising again, forcing him to confront the truth he had avoided for years. He had never retired because he was tired of killing. He had retired because he was afraid he could no longer trust himself not to. Yet here he was, dragged back into violence by a world that had no other choice. During his years as an assassin, he had been trained to observe every detail, to measure the rhythm of conflict before committing to a strike. He'd moved through battlefields with frost-cold efficiency, earning the moniker Ghost of Winter because he arrived without warning and departed without leaving a trace. He had accepted the title then, believing it meant mastery. Only later did he understand it meant isolation. The final mission, the one that ended his career, returned to him now with a sting sharper than the freezing air. A miscalculation, a collapsing building, a family inside. His shot had been perfect, the consequences had not. After that, the agency had called it an acceptable loss, but Callum hadn't accepted it at all. He disappeared into the wilderness, so no one could ever ask him to risk innocent lives again. But the aliens had not come offering a negotiation. They had come demanding dominion. The UN envoy who reached his cabin had spoken with a quiet desperation he recognized immediately. Humanity wasn't sending a champion out of tradition. They were sending one because Earth lacked the strength to resist otherwise. That unspoken truth had cut deeper than any blade. For all his desire to remain hidden, Callum couldn't ignore the weight of an entire world leaning on a single decision. He agreed to fight because if he didn't, billions would pay for his refusal. His burden suddenly seemed insignificant in comparison. As the present snapped back into focus, the warlord loomed over him, exoskeletal armor humming with predatory anticipation. Its species believed combat was sacred ritual, a stage for dominance rather than morality. To them, humanity had appeared weak, fractured, and ripe for assimilation. Sending only one representative had seemed to prove their assumptions. The warlord's confidence was unshakable, and Callum recognized the arrogance for what it was, a flaw, not a strength. Overconfidence narrowed perception, dulled instinct. He knew because he had once made the same mistake. Callum lifted his gaze and studied the warlord anew, analyzing the movement patterns, the decay of its balance, the slight irregularity in its breathing apparatus. Nothing about the opponent was invincible. Pain still ran through Callum's body like fire under ice, but he welcomed the sensation. It reminded him he was alive, still capable of choosing how this fight would end. His thoughts settled, sharp and controlled. The memories that had once crippled him now steadied him. He did not need redemption. He needed purpose. And purpose had finally found him. The warlord lunged, but Callum shifted aside with a subtle, practiced motion, feeling the rush of displaced air skim past his cheek. He forced himself upright, every muscle protesting, but determination fortified each movement. The alien crowd's holographic jeers crackled around him like static, though he paid them no mind. He had fought in cities where the air itself burned from chemical fires. He had infiltrated stations drifting above gas giants where gravity fluctuated unpredictably. A hostile audience was the least of his concerns. "You still stand," the warlord growled through its translator, tone oscillating between annoyance and curiosity. Why cling to a doomed struggle? Callum steadied his breath, eyes sharp behind the fractured remnants of his visor. "Because I've seen what happens when no one stands." For the first time, the warlord hesitated, struck not by fear, but by the unfamiliar sensation of uncertainty. Callum watched the moment carefully, storing it like ammunition for later. The hesitation meant his opponent could be shaken. Snow swirled harder, obscuring the edges of the arena, turning the world into a shifting palette of white and shadow. Callum tightened his stance, preparing for the next exchange. The warlord's doubt lingered, a hairline fracture in a mountain of alien pride. It was enough to begin cracking. Callum felt the ground tilt beneath him an instant before the warlord's shockwave detonated. Snow surged upward in a blinding plume, and the ridge buckled as if the mountain itself recoiled. He dove sideways, barely avoiding the fracturing earth, but the explosion's force still hurled him into a jagged pillar of ice. His breath escaped in a sharp grunt as pain reverberated through his sternum. The world spun, but he forced his senses to steady. He had survived worse, and the warlord's newfound desperation only confirmed what Callum had already sensed. The alien was no longer in control of the fight. It was lashing out, unsettled by the mere fact that he continued to rise. The warlord leapt after him, landing with a quake that sent cracks, spiderwebbing through the frozen terrain. Callum pushed himself upright, fingers trembling from the cold that seeped through the damaged seams of his gloves. He assessed the environment, noting the ice pillars jutting from the ravine walls and the uneven ground that formed slippery slopes. What had been designed as a theatrical combat arena had become a chaotic battlefield, one that favored agility over brute force. And if there was one thing Callum still possessed in abundance, it was adaptability. The warlord swung an energy blade with enough force to bisect a small vehicle, carving molten grooves in the ice. Callum rolled beneath the strike, feeling heat scorch the air above him. He countered with a sharp kick to the alien's knee joint, aiming at the slightly weaker articulation he'd marked earlier. The blow caused the warlord to stagger, a split-second misstep that revealed another truth. Its enhancements were overclocked, draining its stamina faster than expected. Each surge of power came with a tremor of instability. As Callum circled the alien, he spoke, not a taunt, but a calculated probe. "You break your own sacred rules for victory. Doesn't that undermine your honor?" The warlord snarled, the translator spitting out a harsh approximation of the sound. "Honor is irrelevant. Only conquest matters." "That's your problem," Callum said quietly. "You think strength is the same as superiority." The alien lunged again, enraged, and this time its attack lacked the precision of its earlier strikes. Callum slid behind a column of ice, listening to the thunderous impacts as the warlord's blade obliterated the pillar. The collapse unleashed a cascade of ice shards, and Callum used the momentary visual distortion to reposition himself. His movements, though slower than in his prime, retained the deliberate efficiency of a lifetime spent surviving impossible situations. He spotted a weakness, the warlord's gravity pack, glowing erratically from earlier damage. If he could disable it, the alien's mobility would plummet. Callum launched himself into a low sprint, zigzagging to exploit the uneven terrain. The warlord spotted him and fired a gravity pulse that tore through a nearby ridge. The blast clipped Callum's side, sending him skidding across the ice, but he held onto consciousness. He refused to let the pain dictate his next decision. Rising with determination, Callum hurled a shard of metal torn from his own ruined armor. It struck the gravity pack precisely where he aimed. Sparks erupted in a violent cascade, and the warlord crashed to one knee as the field collapsed around it. Snow began to fall more naturally again, freed from the artificial distortions that had suspended it earlier. Callum took the change as confirmation that the tide had shifted. The alien roared, the sound guttural and raw, not transmitted but voiced from its true throat. It lunged with reckless fury, swinging wildly, and Callum used that recklessness to his advantage. He ducked beneath a wide arc and drove forward, slashing at the exposed region beneath the alien shoulder plate. The blade sank deeper than before, drawing a surge of luminescent fluid. The warlord staggered backward, momentarily stunned. Callum didn't allow himself triumph. He simply steadied his breath, grounding himself in the moment. He had fought enough battles to know that cornered opponents were the most dangerous. The warlord's eyes, dark, volcanic, and flickering with unstable rage, confirmed it. "You force my hand," the alien hissed. "I will not fall to you." Callum braced himself, recognizing the shift in tone. The warlord spread its arms, drawing power from a forbidden reserve, energy crackling across its armor in uncontrolled arcs. The air thickened, vibrating with a dangerous resonance. Callum understood instantly. The warlord was preparing a final, catastrophic charge, one that could end them both. He tightened his grip on his last functional weapon and steadied his stance, the cold biting into every exposed seam. Snow swirled around them like a rising storm, and Callum felt something settle in his chest. Not fear, but resolve. If this was the final exchange, he would meet it head-on. The warlord surged forward in a blur of incandescent fury, each step cracking the ice beneath its feet as unstable power rippled through its augmented frame. Callum felt the vibration through his boots, a deep, resonant tremor that warned him the alien's body was nearing collapse, but not quickly enough to save him if he misjudged its final charge. He steadied his stance, centering his breath despite the sharp ache in his ribs. Survival depended on precision, not brute force, and precision had always been his greatest weapon. The snowstorm churned around them, pulled into spirals by the warlord's energy aura, turning the ravine into a vortex of light and shadow. When the alien lunged, it moved with terrifying speed, but its motions carried a fatal irregularity. The enhancements that had once elevated it were now devouring its stability. Callum slid to the side, boots skidding on the slick ice, and swung his blade in a measured arc metal med armor with a resonant clang, and the blow deflected the warlord's attack just enough to prevent it from bisecting him. The alien's momentum carried it past him, carving a molten gouge into the ice wall. Steam roared upward where the blade met frozen earth, briefly obscuring them both. Callum didn't retreat. He couldn't. The warlord turned with a furious bellow, its exoskeleton sparking violently, and Callum rushed forward to meet it. Pain radiated through every limb, but pain was irrelevant. It would fade, or he would. He targeted the failing gravity pack once more, slashing at the exposed circuitry. The pack ruptured in an explosion of sparks that threw both combatants backward. He hit the ground hard, snow cushioning the impact only slightly, and forced himself upright before the world could tilt again. The warlord staggered, its breathing ragged and uneven. For the first time, its eyes flickered with something other than rage, recognition that the battle might not end in its favor. Yet it still refused surrender. With trembling hands, it reached for the last forbidden surge, channeling raw energy into its neural implants. Blue-white light bled across its armor like cracks in porcelain. "That power will kill you," Callum warned, voice steady despite the strain. "If victory demands my life," the warlord rasped, "then so be it." Callum inhaled slowly, letting the cold fill his lungs. "Then let's finish it." The alien charged again, unstable and staggering, but still monstrously strong. Callum met the rush head-on. They collided with a deafening impact that sent shards of ice flying in every direction. The warlord's blade grazed Callum's shoulder, tearing through armor and flesh, but Callum didn't falter. He drove his blade upward into the seam beneath the alien's throat, the only vulnerable point he had left to exploit. For a heartbeat, they remained locked together, breaths mingling in the frigid air. Then the warlord's body convulsed, lights dimming as the enhancements overloaded. Callum twisted the blade deeper, severing the neural conduit. The alien collapsed, knees buckling, and Callum stepped back as its massive form crashed into the snow. Silence followed, broken only by the hiss of cooling metal. Callum's vision blurred around the edges, but he remained standing, refusing to fall before his opponent was fully still. A constellation of drones descended silently from above, projecting symbols of acknowledgement across the ravine. The watching empire had their answer. A single human had triumphed. Bound by their ancient code, the alien armada would withdraw. Callum let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding, his exhaustion settling like lead. He began the slow climb out of the ravine, each step deliberate. The storm eased as he ascended, and by the time he reached the ridge, the alien ship was already retreating into the clouds. Snow drifted gently once more, softening the battlefield with quiet indifference. Callum returned to his cabin hours later, bleeding, bruised, and unsteady. He pushed the door, closed behind him, and let the silence settle. The world was safe, at least for now. He sank onto a worn chair beside the window and watched the snowfall gather along the sill. For years, he had believed his purpose died with his past. Tonight proved otherwise. A faint smile tugged at the corner of his mouth as he whispered into the quiet room. One man was enough. But deep inside, he also understood something else. Peace, once earned, must still be protected. And if the universe ever came knocking again, he would be ready to stand once more.